Well, it's great to have Hugh Bradlaugh with us today, talking about the chapter that he wrote for CEDA's 2015 report, Australia's Future Workforce. Thanks for joining us today, Hugh.
It's a pleasure, Melinda.
In your chapter, you talked a lot about emerging technologies, the Internet of Things, cloud, big data. How do you think those technologies have evolved in the 3 years since you contributed to CEDA's report?
I think, to me, one of the biggest surprises has been the amount of hype surrounding artificial intelligence. There's a company that tracks the number of times certain things are mentioned in earnings calls, and artificial intelligence is skyrocketed. And every conference I go to, there's some executive from a corporation talking about artificial intelligence. They haven't got the faintest clue what they're talking about, but they're still talking about it. What I think people have misunderstood is this notion that there is no artificial intelligence, there's machine learning, and machine learning is very specific. It's about recognizing a pattern. And if you've got the data to train a machine, you can recognize patterns, providing those patterns are repeatable, statistically static, in other words. But the actual technology progression, for me, the biggest change has been the success of machine vision, which is a very specific part of artificial intelligence. Machine vision and speech recognition. You know, the notion that you'll talk to your house, say, Alexa, turn off the lights for me. Okay, Google, when's the next train coming, etc.
I mean, you talked about the number of times that artificial intelligence as a term is cropping up in earnings reports. Do you think that the hype is well ahead of where the technology itself actually is?
Absolutely. The reason I know it's well ahead is we don't have the skill base to actually really be exploiting it effectively in most Australian corporations. We've had for years a declining maths base. It hit a low in 2012 in terms of number of students doing intermediate and advanced maths at school, and it hasn't risen since then. And in order to be effective in using these technologies, you need to be very mathematically inclined. And in fact, I would go so far as to say that if you really want to be a data scientist in the 21st century, you'd better have done advanced maths at VCE level.
As I said earlier, this has been one of CEDA's most popular reports. It clearly shows that the community itself is interested in this work. Why do you think that is? And is it just the sort of workforce implication, or do you think it's broader than that?
Since I started talking about these technologies about 5 or 6 years ago, the number one question I always got was, what should my kids study? People are concerned about their children's future, justifiably so. They can't assume that the job that they do today is the job that their kid can follow them in tomorrow. And so they want to know, what should they be studying to position themselves for the work that will come in the future? There will be new jobs, clearly. We don't know what they are, and we don't know the level of destruction of existing jobs, but I think people are realizing that the way their job is done today will not be the way it's done by their children.
So what's your answer when people ask you what their kids should study?
I always say don't do law and medicine, and I have two who've done law and one who's done medicine. So my advice is not that valid, but no, my answer is twofold. I think that the STEM disciplines are extremely important. People, debate this, but the fact is that we live in an increasingly technological world, and if you treat it as a black box, you become a victim. So if you want to shape the future, you really do need those STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and maths, and starting them early. The second thing is, it's no good. In my day, you could be an engineering geek and hide in a corner and just do a whole lot of maths and stuff and never talk to a human being, and you'd be a perfectly successful and productive engineer. That's not going to be the way it works in the future. The jobs that remain will be about interfacing with humans. And to interface with humans, you have to have empathy. And the question I have in my mind is empathy trainable? Or is it something you learn at your parents' knees?
There certainly is a lot of fear around artificial intelligence, possibly the language itself and the name itself. Yeah. But what else do you think sits underneath that in terms of this reaction? And we've seen it recently in terms of the My Health record. Yeah. And there's sort of immediate response to not want to be part of that. I mean, what's your take on all of that?
I think people have quite correctly interpreted artificial intelligence, so-called, as a threat to their jobs, and that's what really concerns them. Then there's another overlay, which is the security issue. So you know, they don't think about the fact that we entrust our entire wealth to a bank, which is just digital information. What happened if that got hacked? You know, we assume that it won't get hacked. And I think we've got justifiable grounds for assuming that my health records won't get hacked. That's not to say they're impervious to being hacked, but it's extremely unlikely.
Well, I think they're valid concerns, but I guess my point too is that they're actually concerns that exist now.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, it's about the digitisation of data, really.
Yeah. I think that is indicative of the fact that for a lot of people, the actual process which ensures the security is quite daunting.
Which sort of leads us into the question of regulation. I think it's a really massive issue for Australia when we think about the pace of change of these technologies. How big a challenge do you think that is for Australia and for policymakers in Australia?
There are two types of regulation you've got to think about here. The one is the regulation that encourages adoption and improvement in lifestyle, economics, quality of life. And the one I always cite there, because I've done a lot of work on it, is on driverless cars. If we could, there are ways of regulating to regulate humans out of the driver's seat. There are huge benefits to doing it, enormous health benefits, productivity benefits, infrastructure benefits, just enormous benefits. So I think it's behoving on governments to actually regulate proactively to ensure that pathway is followed. The second regulation are the things you want to stop. And this is where life gets very interesting, because you can't stop the technology itself. That's more of a force of nature. But what you can do is you can regulate ownership and use of data and sharing of data. And I think that's the thing that governments need to focus on first, is what are the rules around data and who collects it and who owns it and how much do they have to share?
If we go back to the driverless car example, the data on how safe they are is just incredible. But it just takes one incident for people to sort of throw their arms up and say, oh, you see, it's not as safe as everyone said, or which I find quite interesting because, of course, every day you listen to the radio and you hear about fatal car crashes, you know, all around Australia. How do we get over that, where the sort of benchmark of safety for one thing is so different to what's happening normally?
Yeah, look, you know, the facts are 94% of traffic accidents are human error. Each year in Australia, 1,300 people die, and 45,000 people go to hospital as a result of traffic accidents. So if 94% is human error, it's fairly safe to assume you'll eliminate 90% of those accidents. The problem you have is, you're quite right, the first failure, you know, everyone jumps on it, and that's the vested interests who are jumping on it because they don't want to see it happen. If you think about our workforce, about 28% of Australian workforce has jobs that involve driving. It's not necessarily their entire job, but it could be. And so they don't want to see this happen because that's the end of their job. That's a huge slab of the workforce who are going to be out of a job. So there will be strong pushback, but it's going to take enormous political leadership to do it.
So new technologies have tremendous scope and opportunity to transform the way we deliver healthcare. And it's clearly an issue top of mind for most people. CEDA actually just recently did a community pulse survey where we asked people what was most important to them from a policy perspective, and basic health care was absolutely number one across the country, for every demographic, for every income group actually. So how do you see emerging technologies changing the face of healthcare, and what are the big opportunities in that space, do you think?
There's a range of technologies which improve distribution of healthcare in terms of geographic distribution. The most important change, though, is around the data. There's very little doubt that if you can assemble enough data about individuals and about the population at large, you can improve the efficacy of interventions by understanding whether they work or not. You can improve individual health care by personalizing the treatments. And so we've got to, first of all, get our data house in order. And that's today's discussion, because the government's finally introduced opt-out. And, you know, the statistics are, there are, 25 million Australians next month, apparently. Something like 6 million have signed up for My Health Record. But then we've got to go beyond that to use that as a springboard for bringing in more data. So what IBM referred to as the exogenous data, the information about your life, you know, where you've been, who you've spoken to, what you've eaten, how much exercise you did. All these factors should be in that. And then we can start applying machine learning to looking for patterns, for identifying that treatment worked well for someone with your patterns, therefore we'll give you that treatment, improving healthcare outcomes that way. So I think that's the big unexplored opportunity, but we're on the cusp of actually being able to go forward with that.
We talked a bit about the potential disruption of jobs through emerging technologies. We've been talking about health and aged care as two areas where technology can have a huge impact. Do you think robots are going to take over everything in an aged care home in the future?
No, look, I don't think they're going to take over everything, but I think what they will do is take over the unpleasant jobs that, you know, people have to do for elderly people today. But I think the thing that will never go away is to give old people some sort of connection with life. And you know, one of the tragic statistics of old aged homes is something like 30% of the residents never have a visitor. And you know, if that happened to me, I can't see the point of being alive. So I think the important human jobs are going to be connecting with people and making them feel alive and making them feel worthwhile.
Well, Hugh, thank you very much for your time today. It's been fantastic.
It's a pleasure, Melinda.